it's also been notable, I would say, that that movement towards the synthesis in the new generation is also taking place across the political spectrum, where prior to all of these cosmopolitan ideals, the progressive ideals taking root, you would have found anyone who would have considered themselves to be conservative, and anyone who would have considered themselves more social democratic would have been on total opposite sides of the spectrum. They might have said, okay, we agree around the communitarian aspects, but otherwise those guys are the political enemies. Whereas actually you find people all across the political spectrum in the United Kingdom. You'll have people like Paul Embury being able to understand why Nigel Farage is having cut through, for example. And I find that to be quite interesting, that, you know, you'll have supporters of the Social Democratic Party understanding why people support reform, and then you'll have the old Blue Labour doing the same thing. I wonder whether that will hold as things develop. But I suppose we'll see if the ideological exuberance of the progressive movement, if that does fall away, whether we will see those parties come head to head. But for now, it almost seems like there are multiple flanks coming at this dominant ideology. Is this something that you see in Europe as well?
Yeah, to some extent. You basically have some very similar reactions. And the way that it works is that you can have big differences on taxation or differences on economic policy, on free trade or protectionism, or on the welfare state. But at the end of the day, these are differences that are political in character. And these are differences that are not as significant as the more foundational cultural ones, which are really about your very existence and really are about, you know, the more foundational system of meaning to which you experience life. And given the fact that sections of the old left are just as much undermined by the way in which there's been an attempt to undermine Western culture or their traditional ideals as the right, there's a kind of basis for a coalition or unity for some time to come. I think that's going to continue. Obviously, it doesn't mean that there's a complete agreement. For example, in Germany, you know, you can have a party like this party organized by Sarah Wagenknecht, who's a left-wing activist whose party managed to do reasonably well for the very first time. They got almost 10% of the vote. And then you have some right-wing parties, but they have very similar policies on migration, very similar policies on the Green Deal and the environment, on some of the more culturally pernicious initiatives that have occurred, like gender and elsewhere. And that's probably going to continue for some time. But I actually think that in the long run, what's going to happen is that the political labels that you and I are using and to which people identify with are themselves going to alter, because the classical left-right division or the social democratic conservative division doesn't really mean very much in the 21st century. And there's going to have to be a new way in which some of the elements of organic continuity with the past, which is what conservatism was essentially about, are going to be reinvented and given shape in the period ahead. Because to a considerable extent, to be a conservative now in England or Britain doesn't mean very much, given what conservatism has become, the way its meaning has been spoiled by the Tory party. So you have to have almost like a new way of expressing yourself in these very new circumstances.
Am I right in thinking that the acceleration of support for these populist sovereigntist parties is quite heavily linked to October the 7th and what we've seen since then? And it's not to say that they didn't exist, that this support didn't exist before, it certainly did. But has there been an acceleration? Because as far as I can tell, when I look at the discourse, I see that we have people that are very concerned about the seeming alliance between those in the more progressive left and those who are supportive of political Islam. and generally anti-Western civilization, and everyone else who seems to now be looking for an outlet for this sense of loss that they're feeling, which they're now seeing is increasing by the day, and it seems to be this urgency. Do we think that's partly what's behind it?
I don't know about Britain. I don't see very much of that in Britain. There's a bit of that, but certainly in places like France, Holland, Belgium, there is now a universal recognition that this phenomenon of Islamo-leftism, this close alliance between the politics of Hamas and the LGBTQ sort of identitarian outlook, is something that people are really disturbed about. It's a really big issue in France at the moment, where the election is going to take place on Sunday, where you have this horrible case of a 12-year-old Jewish girl being really badly raped by 3 boys and called dirty Jews, and all kinds of horrible things. And you have the situation where the French right is horrified by this development and is determined to make this into an issue, also make anti-Semitism into a political issue, whereas the left, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is trying to minimize this as if it's an incident, a random incident that's got no wider kind of significance. And that kind of extra polarization that's occurred after October 7th is really, really important in many parts of Europe. And I think it's going to have a more long-term legacy to it, because as you have the growing convergence and synthesis of Hamas-type radicalism with conventional Western type of identity politics, you're going to have this strange brew emerging, which a lot of people will find quite grotesque and unacceptable.
Let's stay with France. We're talking here about Islamism, concern for Islamism, and you have written recently about a potential civil war in France. At least that was the headline of one of your Substacks. And you're not the only one who's brought that up. 3 years ago, there were 20 retired generals who you reference in one of your articles who wrote an open letter to the French public explaining that they believed civil war was on the cards because of these republics that had developed within the towns and cities of the republic itself. And they wrote about Islamists having taken over towns and cities. And indeed, this is what the potential to-be 28-year-old Prime Minister Jordan Bardella speaks of as his own lived experience growing up in a part of Paris. And now President Macron is weighing in using the same language of civil war, but this time he's using it as though any vote for the parties to the left or right of him could lead to civil war. And you can find The Guardian writing just this week that France is on the brink. Why is it that the likes of President Macron, The Guardian, that France is on the brink now, but it wasn't on the brink at any other point in the past due to the policies of that political class?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting that Macron must have read my article on the impending civil war and wrote one himself a day later. I think that basically what they are really saying, almost like kind of like a Freudian slip when they talk about it, is that the way they look at it is that they're, if you're going to have a situation where someone like the Rassemblement National is going to win the election, and maybe Jordan Bardella will become prime minister or could become prime minister, that's not something that they're going to accept. They're not going to just simply lie back and let the democratic course of events just take place. I think that what they're really saying is that this is something that's so unacceptable that they will react against. And when we're talking about civil wars, what I'm really worried about is that their side, it's Macron and all the people that are part and parcel of Macron's coterie, who have a very powerful position within the civil service and the institution of the state, but also cultural and other institutional media, I think there's a very good chance that they're going to try to find a way of preventing the democratic process from being realized. And what they really are saying as well is that the challenge represented by Bardella is so great that it's not something that can be absorbed into normal French democratic politics, in the way that they define it. And therefore, I think that this is going to be the single most important election in Europe, because its outcome will have an impact not just on France, but also on the European Union. France and Germany are the two mainstays of the European Union. But it will also have a big impact on the rest of Europe, because if a movement like the RN can succeed in France, then that will suggest to people in other parts of Europe that something similar can work elsewhere. So I see this as being a very, very much an existentialist moment. And the question is whether or not the democratic will of the people will be respected. I mean, obviously, it may well be the case that the very last minute or very last moment, the RN will not do as well as expected. But at the moment, by all accounts, their vote is not only holding up, but is actually doing better than previously thought.
It's interesting. It seems to have rhyming qualities with the lead up to the Brexit referendum, where everyone was so certain that it was going to be a Remain vote. And we all know what happened next. And then everyone realized they'd been living in these echo chambers, I suppose, is probably the right way of putting it. And there had been, following that, many years of trying to frustrate it because they just couldn't believe that this is what they had to do. And what's quite interesting is that as most people play the ostrich game and bury their heads in the sand, thinking there's no way it's going to go that way, and they don't realize that actually the common person who might not necessarily know all of the jargon from the Financial Times or the broadsheets, they have a real sense of the impact of policies and how the world's changing around them. And it doesn't matter what you end up telling people in the frenzied hysteria in the lead up to an election, that they shouldn't vote that way because the world's going to end. They will end up voting that way to make sure that they can put a shot across the bows in whatever way they can towards the political establishment. So we will see if this is what happens. The institutional pressures. So we've talked a little bit about the use of language, such as could there be a looming civil war, to try to scare voters.